Well, hello and welcome to Outdoor Oklahoma. I'm Todd Craighead. Now, the sights and sounds that you've been enjoying thus far are that of one of Oklahoma's most unique and spectacular bird species. It's called the booming, and it happens each year as a mating ritual of the lesser prairie chicken. And today we're going to be discussing the aspects of the lesser prairie chicken in Oklahoma, and to help us do that is Russ Horton, our private lands and wildlife diversity specialist. Now, supervisor. Now, Russ, have you actually ever seen the booming happen?
I've been very fortunate to be able to watch the lesser prairie chicken on their booming ground several times, and it's something that touches you forever. You'll never forget it, and I highly recommend that everyone take advantage of the opportunity to get out and see these unique birds while we still have that opportunity.
You bet. Well, that's no doubt true. I know I've had the pleasure of seeing it, and I'll never forget it as well. Now, it's no secret that these populations, as well as many other prairie species, have been in decline in recent years.
That's correct. The prairie chicken is in decline, as are most of our prairie species. We're out here this morning in one of the few remnants of good native prairie, which at one time covered a whole bunch of Oklahoma. There's not as much of it left as there was here in Oklahoma or nationwide, and as a result, our prairie species, including the lesser prairie chicken, are in decline.
Well, we're going to catch up with Russ and talk about more about steps and measures that we're taking here in Oklahoma to help sustain the lesser prairie chicken. But now let's enjoy getting to know the lesser prairie chickens past and present.
The prairie chicken is an iconic species of the American West. Along with the buffalo, black-tailed prairie dog, and the jackrabbit, prairie chickens not only provided sustenance to Native Americans, but also likely provided inspiration to their dances, artwork, and songs. Until farming and ranching operations were developed in the late 1800s, prairie chickens and other native wildlife provided critical secondary food sources to hungry settlers. Unfortunately, habitats that prairie chickens and many other prairie-evolved species rely upon have shrunk substantially over the past 100 years. Conversion of native vegetation to agriculture, urban sprawl, decades of fire suppression, construction of highways and other public utilities have all played a role in altering Oklahoma's prairie landscape from what it was in the pre-settlement era. While some wildlife species have adapted well to the changes, others have not fared so well. In fact, several of the prairie's birds and animals are some of America's greatest species of concern due to shrinking habitats. One of these is the prairie chicken, and specifically the lesser prairie chicken subspecies that inhabits the short grass, high plains of northwest Oklahoma and the Panhandle. Historically, there were 4 recognized subspecies of prairie chickens in the U.S. One of these, known as the heath hen, became extinct in the 1920s along the central and northeast Atlantic coast due primarily to habitat loss. Although not extinct, another subspecies of prairie chicken is the Atwater prairie chicken, which resides today only on small refuges located within the Texas Gulf Coast Plain and has been listed on the Endangered Species list since 1967. It is believed less than 100 Atwater prairie chickens survive in the wild. The most common subspecies of prairie chickens found in the U.S. is the greater prairie chicken. Encountered and documented by early explorers of the American West, including Lewis and Clark on their historic Corps of Discovery, the greater prairie chicken's historical range included a vast area of the Midwest's tallgrass prairie. Today, the range of the tallgrass prairie has shrunk to less than 20% of what it was just a century ago. And accordingly, the population of greater prairie chickens has declined substantially from historic numbers. Today, greater prairie chickens can still be found in northeast Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, and even far north into portions of Nebraska and the Dakotas, parts of Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. While the decline in greater prairie chickens is of special concern to wildlife biologists where they exist, they have not experienced a decline as rapid and dramatic as that of their smaller cousins, the lesser prairie chickens of the short and mixed grass high plains. Lesser prairie chickens have an appearance very similar to their greater prairie chicken cousins. One distinguishing characteristic is the color of the air sacs on the sides of the male's neck that are inflated during their mating rituals called booming. On lesser prairie chickens, the sacs are more pink or reddish in color compared to the yellow or orange color found on greater prairie chickens. The size of each subspecies is also different. Lesser prairie chickens are approximately 10% smaller than their tall grass cousins. All species of prairie chickens exhibit the same unique mating ritual on their booming grounds, which is also known as lekking behavior. For over 50 years, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several other conservation groups have been documenting and monitoring lesser prairie chicken leks within the state. Today, there are over 70 known lesser prairie chicken leks within 8 counties in northwest Oklahoma, and we expect to find additional leks with aerial surveys. By far, the county with the highest number of leks is Beaver County. Of special concern to wildlife biologists, over the last 90 to 100 years, the population of lesser prairie chickens has declined by 90%. Unfortunately, ongoing studies suggest that the decline in these birds is not due to one single limiting factor, but to a complex combination of both environmental and human influence conditions.
Well, Russ, obviously there are many different factors that affect lesser prairie chicken populations. Some of those we at the Wildlife Department have a pretty good handle on. Some of them we're still learning a lot more about. Can you kind of go through some of those different factors that we're looking at that affect prairie chickens?
Yes, Todd. Obviously, the weather. It's a major factor. Lesser prairie chickens, all wildlife species. Unfortunately, Mother Nature's not on our payroll, so we can't necessarily make her work for us like we'd like to. If we could,
Sure.
perhaps a lot of these problems we wouldn't have to be dealing with. But we're talking with the lesser prairie chicken. It's a non-migratory bird, a fairly small home range. It's a short-lived bird, average lifespan 3 years or less. And so any disturbance or any catastrophe out on the prairie can significantly impact these birds. But there's a lot of different things going on. There's not one simple push button fix. Conversion of native prairie habitat, like we've said, we've lost a lot of prairie habitat to various things. Conversion to agriculture, conversion to non-native grasses. We've seen large-scale fire suppression over the last many years, and as a result of that, we're seeing plants that normally wouldn't occur on the prairie. One of the big ones here in Oklahoma, eastern red cedar, a tremendous invasion of eastern red cedar into former prairie habitats. The birds tend to avoid that. Also development from road and suburban infrastructure on what used to be prairie to right now we have a burgeoning industry in both oil and gas and wind power development, transmission and so forth. And all of those factors fragment the prairie, and places that once were inhabited by prairie chickens are not as good a habitat as they used to be.
Well, Russ, obviously we still need to find a balance, because in our society, as you've mentioned, oil and gas is still there's a great need for that, as well as the expanding wind power for electricity in prairie chicken habitat. So how is the Wildlife Department taking into account those things that our society still needs and finding a balance for lesser prairie chickens?
Right. The Wildlife Department, we understand that there are other demands on that prairie habitat, the energy needs, the food needs of the consumers. We're working with the various industries to make sure that development occurs in a responsible manner, and we're also spearheading an effort to create an Oklahoma lesser prairie chicken conservation plan. We're working with a multitude of other agencies and stakeholders to develop a conservation plan that not only takes into account the needs of the lesser prairie chicken, but also the needs of all of the other stakeholders out on the prairie. And our intent is to work together to develop and implement a plan that will maintain populations of lesser prairie chickens into the future, but that takes into account the needs of the numerous stakeholders that also share that prairie habitat.
Well, that's great. We actually had a chance to go to one of those stakeholder meetings and visit with some of those other team members. Let's hear from them now.
The BLM is a landowner and a mineral owner in all 5 states where the lesser prairie chicken occurs. And in New Mexico, the BLM has over 1 million acres in conservation agreements with lesser prairie chicken conservation measures, and the BLM is also trying to take that experience and bring it to the other 4 states, including Oklahoma. Currently in Oklahoma, all the BLM leases have prairie chicken stipulations on them to help ensure conservation of the bird, and we continue to work with the ODWC and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to further develop measures that help to protect the lesser prairie chicken in western Oklahoma as they relate to oil and gas well permitting.
OACD and its member conservation districts are primarily working to make sure that landowners know what programs are available through Farm Bill conservation programs through NRCS, FSA, also partners programs with Fish and Wildlife and ODWC to help them to improve habitat. We're also exploring ways where we can possibly set up a program where they can get paid directly per acre for the habitat work that they do. So besides getting assistance on cost share on habitat, they also make a little bit of money off of protecting the species and hopefully do work to make sure that we can help protect this bird and keep it from being listed.
The eastern red cedar have really taken over a lot of our wildlife habitat, and it's become really essential for the lesser prairie chicken that we burn more acres. It's what we'd call the low-hanging fruit, and to do that, we are an organization trying to educate producers on the value of burning, and also to provide liability insurance so they are incentivized to burn. The lesser prairie chicken is really impacted by the eastern red cedar and other invasive species that are growing out in our areas, and fires are definitely a way to control that. And that's what we're concerned about. We want to see the number of acres increased in burn, and what we really want is see safe burns, but also very effective and timely burns in Oklahoma.
Well, earlier we had a chance to hear from a couple other of those stakeholders that the Wildlife Department's working with. Now let's hear from a couple more.
The Nature Conservancy is about conserving species and their habitats, and one of particular concern to us is the lesser prairie chicken. It has declined greatly from what it originally was. We are working in western Oklahoma with our own property. We have our own preserve, the Four Canyon Preserve in Ellis County, which is a site in which we have performed land management practices which we think are good for prairie chicken habitat. Since we've done that, we've seen prairie chickens come back to the preserve. We want that site to be an anchor point for us to work with private landowners in that whole landscape out there, as well as our other partners with the Department of Wildlife and so on, to hopefully improve their habitat and have it become a place where prairie chickens can live also.
Our primary responsibility is to help put conservation on the ground on privately owned lands. And part of that effort includes wildlife habitat, including the lesser prairie chicken. And we basically have 2 mechanisms in which we utilize to get conservation on the ground, help landowners. Number 1 being through conservation planning. And in relation to prairie chicken, we basically go out with landowners and help them do an assessment of the wildlife habitat, what the threats are and what the needs might be, and help them plan practices to address those needs to meet the needs of the prairie chicken. And the second mechanism we use are Farm Bill programs, conservation programs such as EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And these are tools that provide financial assistance or cost share assistance to landowners to basically apply and implement those practices on the land.
Now, Russ, we know that the lesser prairie chicken is a candidate to actually be put on the threatened and endangered species list. How will that affect landowner practices if it is listed?
Right, you're right, Todd. The lesser prairie chicken is a candidate for listing, and with that listing process, there's a lot of information floating around, a lot of misinformation floating around. What the Department of Wildlife Conservation is doing, first and foremost, we're trying to maintain populations and increase the populations of lesser prairie chickens so that a listing doesn't need to happen.
Yes.
But we're also working on a candidate conservation agreement with assurances, a CCAA for private landowners in Oklahoma. And what that will do, if we have the candidate conservation agreement with assurances, the landowner enrolls, agrees to certain practices, a lot of which a lot of our landowners are already doing on their property, that benefit the lesser prairie chicken, and he's given assurance that if the bird is listed, that then he won't be required to do anything additional beyond what he's already agreed to do under this CCAA.
Okay, that's great. We're now going to visit with Ken Collins from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to discuss more about the process of how an animal is listed on a threatened and endangered species list.
Congress, through the Endangered Species Act, gave the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service the federal lead role in managing and conserving federally threatened and endangered species. And it's a responsibility that we take very seriously and must follow some very rigid and strict guidelines. In some ways, adding a species to the list of federally threatened and endangered species implies to some extent that perhaps we haven't done a very good job at managing the threats to the species. But on the other hand, adding a species to the list often serves to focus conservation efforts so that we can achieve conservation for the species that we might not have been able to achieve otherwise. Unfortunately, due to the declining range and declining numbers of lesser prairie chickens, it's a species that's been considered for this process since 1998. The guiding principle under the Endangered Species Act requires that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service consider the very best information that's available. In doing so, we solicit information from various entities, including the state game and fish agencies occurring where the lesser prairie chicken still occurs. We solicit information from species experts and from other interested parties. And we don't move forward with our decision until we've had a chance to consider all of that information that's been provided to us. If the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decides to move forward, we will publish a notice in the Federal Register. If that notice gets published, the Fish and Wildlife Service then, under the Endangered Species Act, has a year from the date of that publication in which we must make our final decision. In addition, if we move forward with a proposed rule, we will also consider any special habitat needs, commonly called critical habitat. Once we publish a proposed rule, the service will open a 60-day comment period at the minimum that will allow the interested public to provide comments to us on our proposed decision. Also, we will have at least one public hearing in at least one location should someone request that we do so. Only after the Fish and Wildlife Service reviews all of the information submitted to us during the comment period and any new scientific information that may become available will we make our final listing determination. At that point, our decision could be to list the lesser prairie chicken as threatened, or we could list the lesser prairie chicken as endangered, or better yet, we could withdraw the proposed rule and not list the lesser prairie chicken at all.
Well, so Russ, what does the future hold for the lesser prairie chicken in Oklahoma?
Well, there is some uncertainty in terms of the listing. You know, the listing is imminent. We'll have a listing decision before too long, either to list or not to list. But notwithstanding, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, for us, we're still interested in implementing lesser prairie chicken conservation. We're developing the plan, we're working with our landowners, we're working with our stakeholders. Our intent is to ensure that the populations of lesser prairie chickens continue to thrive into the future.
That's great.
Another thing that I might mention that we're working on, we're not quite there yet, but we're working on a public viewing opportunity. As you know, birding is big business, and especially these unique birds with the limited range like the lesser prairie chicken. And so we're working to offer to the public an opportunity to come out on a beautiful spring morning and actually get up close and personal with the birds as they're on the booming ground. Watch the unique display and be a better person for it.
Well, that is great. Obviously, if that happens, when that part happens, we'll definitely let people know how they can take advantage of that very unique and special opportunity.
You bet.
Well, Russ, thanks for joining me today, and we'll look forward to hearing what's in store for the prairie chickens in Oklahoma.
All right.
You know, if you'd like to find out other ways that you can explore your outdoor world, connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. For all of us at your Wildlife Department, I'm Todd Craighead, and we'll see you somewhere new next time on Outdoor Oklahoma.